contributions there too that will interest anybody who is keen on or involved in marine plastics. About Linda Godfrey. She's a principal scientist, waste and circular economy at the CSIR, and she is manager of the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap Implementation Unit for South Africa. She's also an extraordinary associate professor at Northwest University. Her own research interests are wide, and they include the role of the waste sector in transitioning South Africa to a green economy, waste innovation, waste economics, and the governance, social, and behavioral aspects of integrated waste management. With her PhD in engineering, Linda has contributed to a number of waste and green economy initiatives for the European Union, the United Nations, our own national departments of science and innovation and environmental affairs and forestry and fisheries, the World Bank, the Academy of Science of South Africa, and the Institute of Waste Management. So not only is she widely experienced, but she's also widely published in the field of waste management in the context of developing countries, and having co-authored or authored over 100 specialist reports, journal articles, and book chapters. As you'll appreciate, the journal has been delighted to have had Linda on board for this special issue, and it's our pleasure to have her present the Marine Plastics Special Issue as one of our most well-respected scientists in this field, locally and internationally. Thanks, Linda, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for the introduction, and I'd just like to welcome everyone that's joining us this morning from both locally in South Africa, regionally, and internationally. And look forward to the discussions. I'd just like to share my screen before I introduce you to the speakers, just to give you a brief introduction. If you can provide the screen back to me, thank you. Just in terms of the context of where this comes from, this marine plastic debris science review that we'll be talking about this morning was initiated by the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap. This roadmap is an initiative of the South African government, which is essentially aimed at directing South Africa's strategic investment and portfolio in waste R&D and innovation in South Africa. The aim of this is essentially to provide more effective decision-making, faster insertion of context-appropriate technology, export of know-how and technology where appropriate, and very importantly, strengthened R&D and innovation capability and capacity in the country. The ultimate objective is through evidence and innovation to support South Africa's implementation of the National Waste Management Strategy. As we all know, marine plastic debris has become an issue of global concern. South Africa was identified by Jambek and colleagues in 2015 as being in the top 20 countries ranked by mass of mismanaged plastic waste. And so to inform South Africa's response to this, there was a need firstly to establish the science base on marine plastic pollution in South Africa. What did we know about the topic? But also very importantly, where were the gaps in knowledge? And in order to use those gaps to prioritize research needs to inform future evidence that would support decision-making and policy development in the country. This science review is also really important in terms of informing a possible future research strategy on marine plastic pollution in South Africa. And so just over a year ago in May 2019, under the Waste R&D and Innovation Roadmap, we published a call for a science review on marine plastic pollution with a focus on 5 specific areas. And each of these papers will be very briefly discussed by the authors this morning. The first starts in terms of land-based sources. Where does our plastic marine pollution originate from, and the pathways that it follows to the marine environment? Secondly, the transport and fate of marine plastic pollution. The third and fourth papers start to touch on the impacts of marine plastic debris, ecological impacts, paper 3, and paper 4 on ecosystem service and economic impacts. And then finally, paper 5 looks at monitoring and methods to be able to evaluate in the future moving forward whether we are having impacts through policy interventions, through decision-making, through informed evidence. Each of our authors are with us this morning. The first paper authored by Karina Faster and Henk Bouwman from Northwest University, the second paper by Peter Ryan from the University of Cape Town, our third paper by Trishan Naidu and colleagues from the University of the Western Cape, the fourth paper by Sumaya Arabi and Anton Naumann from the CSIR, and our fifth paper by Peter Ryan and colleagues from the University of Cape Town and Nelson Mandela Metro University. Before I hand over to our first speaker this morning, I'd just like to acknowledge the various institutions, organizations that have partnered with us in this journey and without whose financial support or contribution these series of publications would not have been possible. I'd also like to thank the number of reviewers that participated in double-blind reviews of each of those publications, as Jane mentioned, to make sure that these series of papers were of the highest scientific standard. So with that, I would like to pass over to our first speaker this morning, Karina Faster from Northwest University, who will be taking us through the first paper on land-based sources. Thank you, Karina.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all. I'll just switch over to my screen for you. Okay, so we're all here because we know that plastic debris, marine plastic debris, is a major international concern. And the question we were facing is, where does these plastics come from? So we started out with this question, and we know that plastic come from land-based and ocean-based sources, and those proportions are a bit are questionable. The global estimate is that, or the global standard is that about 80% comes from land-based sources and 20% from ocean-based sources. So as Linda previously mentioned, the JAMBEC study in 2017 kind of set the benchmark for contributions to marine plastic by several countries, which ranked South Africa 11th, with between 90 and 250,000 tons of plastic entering the ocean every year from South African soils. And they also estimated that South Africa has 56% mismanaged plastic. So the point of this review was to see where the plastics come from and how they enter the ocean. So we see most of the plastic from South Africa enters the ocean via land. And we estimated, with some of the assumptions that JAMBEC used, but with data from the State of Waste report published in 2018, that between 15 and 40,000 tons of plastic enter the ocean each year from South Africa, and that's about 6-fold less than what was previously thought. So we also considered the ways of entry and the sources that these plastic have to enter the environment. So what we found is that there are a lot less plastic entering the ocean than we previously thought from South Africa. But the big question remaining is what happens to that plastic, and is it only oceanic plastic that we have a problem with? So the highlights from this paper, as I previously mentioned, that between 50 and 40,000 tons of plastic enter the ocean, and it's 6 times less than previously estimated, which kind of gives us a more realistic view of where we stand in terms of oceanic plastic, and also how we can manage these inputs into the ocean. We also found that rivers act as major sinks for plastic. As you can see in the image above, lots of plastic get trapped, whether it be macroplastics or microplastics, in these river systems, and these can also act as possible secondary source of plastic. We also found that surveying the data and the literature available, that up to 40% of the country's wastewater is untreated. This is due to our wastewater treatment plants that are not in optimal condition. Up to 55% of our wastewater treatment plants are either in a critical state or at high risk, which leaves much of our wastewater untreated and releases plastic into the environment via untreated wastewater as well. And we also found that there are major data gaps in the waste sector and uncertainties in terms of reporting. So the major gaps that we have identified are the portion of land-based versus ocean-based plastic inputs from South Africa. As I previously mentioned, the the global standard is about 80% from land-based sources and 20% from ocean-based sources, but we need to refine that to see what the impact of ocean-based sources are as well. Then volumes of hotspots of illegal and informal dumps. So this is one of the major points that we found is one of the big issues in South Africa is major illegal and informal dumps. People and companies leave their litter and their plastic, especially in informal areas, also seen on this picture next to a river. And you see thousands upon thousands of these. We have data gaps in waste management, and then plastics in the river sediments that can act as a possible sink, and that might also be one of the answers for the missing plastic problem. And it can then also be a secondary source. And we found the wastewater treatment plants and effluents are big issues, and we also have very little data available on that. And then a big issue in terms of vehicle tire wear that the whole world is looking at this stage. We have no data available for that in plastic in South Africa, as the vehicle tires wear and they can release these plastics into the environment. So that is just a brief outline of what we found in that in our paper. So back to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Karina. I'm not going to take questions now. We will deal with all of those later. I'd encourage you please to pop your questions into the Q&A box that we can address those. But I'd like to introduce you to Peter Ryan from the University of Cape Town. We'll be talking about our second thematic area, which is around fate and transport of marine plastic. Peter, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Linda. I'm just hopefully getting this to screen share. Can you all see a horrible picture of the ocean looking like it shouldn't look?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so wonderful. All right, so my job was to sort of take the next step in the chain and say, what happens to all of the plastic once it enters the ocean? And in terms of plugging the offshore source gap, we do have some data which isn't actually in the paper, but I thought I'd just put it up as kind of fun. So this is just looking at the proportion of bottles from foreign versus local sources compared to street litter. And you can see that as you move away from Cape Town, the proportion of foreign bottles gets higher. So there clearly is an offshore source. And this is mostly from ships. But if you look, this is all PET bottles. As soon as you look at HDPE bottles and loose lids, then you see a very different signal, mainly long distance transfer from Indonesia across the South Indian Ocean. But having said all that, the problem definitely lies mainly with local source material, and we can see this from the distribution of macroplastics around the coast. So we have a pretty good idea of where the problem lies. And we see this signal of urban centers being the major sources, despite the fact that beach cleaning efforts are concentrated around those urban centers. And microplastics, which are not affected by beach cleaning very much because it's very difficult to do anything about them, also show that same sort of distribution of concentrations around the urban centers. And this is a signal that's been going for 30, 40 years without any real change. And thanks to Shireen Collins' really excellent paper, we have quite a good idea of what happens to the plastic that enters the sea from the urban centers of South Africa. Now, bear in mind, this is oceanographic sort of predictive modeling. So they seed the floating plastic into the ocean some distance offshore. So if anything, it's overestimating the offshore transport. Our empirical evidence from trials releasing into rivers suggests that a much higher proportion than this figure indicates actually strands. So we should be seeing an awful lot of plastic on our beaches, as Karina's just said. We all know the Jambeck paper, which paints South Africa in a very bad light. But when we look at the amount of plastic actually floating out at sea, the amount of plastic floating is an order of magnitude or more or less than the estimated global input per year. So for the last 5 years or so, there have been various attempts to try to find this missing plastic. And the one suggestion is that it's on the seafloor. We don't have a lot of evidence for seafloor plastic off South Africa, but what we do have suggests that it's relatively low, certainly lower than any of the studies that have been conducted in the Northern Hemisphere. And the ROV footage, which is currently being examined, also suggests very low densities of plastic on the continental shelf. So maybe there's export off the shelf, but it's certainly not a major deposit for the missing plastic in this case. So if the Jambeck estimate is correct, we should be seeing coastal inputs of the order of 10 to 50 kilograms per meter of beach along the South African coast, obviously centered around the urban centers, but the standing stocks are much lower than that. Of course, standing stocks are misleading because it depends on turnover rates, which we don't have good estimates for, and also beach cleaning efforts. But if we measure daily accumulation rates, or if we measure the direct inputs into the ocean, both of them suggest that the amount of plastic exported from land is at least an order of magnitude less than the Jambeck estimate. So I think we've got three independent lines of evidence now from the first review papers, just looking at material flows within the country, and then looking at the fluxes from land into sea, and then looking at fluxes from sea onto land, all suggesting that we're nowhere near as large a problem as it's made out to be. That's not, of course, to say that there isn't a problem. We still have perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 tons of plastic going into the ocean every year, and we need to do something about that. So what are the implications of this paper? I think it's clear that we need a better understanding of plastic fluxes, and the gaps in particular are pertaining to the seafloor and midwater. We know virtually nothing about plastic suspended in midwater around the coast of South Africa. My personal perspective is that we should get a better estimate of land-based inputs, because that's where the bulk of the material comes from, and it also relates directly to mitigation. We'll talk more about that in the monitoring paper. The fact that we don't have a balanced plastic mass budget doesn't alter policy. We know there's a problem and the focus should be on tackling it. And the fact that most plastic derives from two local sources has two advantages for us. Firstly, we can monitor the efficacy of mitigation measures effectively, and by reducing local sources, we'll see a rapid local benefit. So that's the good news part of the story. That's my story.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to pass on to our third speaker today, Sershin, who will be talking about the ecological impacts of marine plastic debris. Sershin?
Thank you. Can everyone see this?
Yes, we can. Okay.
So first of all, I'm grateful that Peter preceded me in that our article, which looked at the impacts of plastic debris on biota and the implications for human health, ran the risk of being sensationalist if we did not approach it from a factual point of view, which is what we tried to do. And I must also preface that this is a South African perspective. The global records indicate that we have had an increase in the number of biota that have been shown to interact with plastics from around 265 species in 1997 to around 557 in 2015. The research in South Africa is largely seminal in a way, beginning with Peter's work in the mid-1980s, which focused largely on seabirds. But since then, a number of fish, turtle, bird, and mammal species have also been shown to be affected. And it's obvious that South Africa's rich marine biodiversity and heavy reliance on edible marine resources makes it imperative that we look at the potential effects on biota. In some instances, data on South Africa's species are seriously lacking, but drawing on the literature can help us draw parallels. So at a very simplistic level, the impacts on biota can be separated into physical and sublethal, with the physical being entanglement, obstruction, smothering, and the sublethal being plastic additives leaching from plastics into the gut and tissue, as well as environmental pollutants and pathogens adhering onto the plastics, which are in turn ingested. When we looked at South African species and the reports in the literature, the reports stretch across a number of groups: sharks, bony fish, turtles, birds, mammals. A large number of the reports are focused on birds, largely as a consequence of Peter's work again. Reports about invertebrates, though they are unpublished examples, we are aware that there are some work being done across the country on a number of invertebrates, but these, at the time of this review, they were not published. So what was interesting is that people are moving towards identifying the main plastic types which are involved in these sorts of interactions of entanglement and ingestion. And that's important. When we draw on the work of monitoring and we try to identify the types of plastics that seem to be dominating certain habitats, then we can start to make correlations between the types of plastic present and the types of interactions and effects that we are seeing. What I also want to point out is that in many cases, the entanglement is a consequence of packaging material, rope, fishing line, and nets. So the examples of entanglement are quite conspicuous, and these are found in both the local and international literature and stretch across sharks, turtles, birds, Cape fur seals. And it is very clear that this is not a new phenomenon. Even though globalization may have increased the occurrence of these interactions, it is not a new phenomenon. What I also want to make abundantly clear is that the reports in literature suggest that even though these impacts are being recorded, the levels, the impacts at the population level are not evident as yet. So from an ingestion point of view, the important points for us to capture in this article were that a lot of species are being recorded to have ingested. These range from seabirds, turtles to estuarine fish. There are ongoing studies on invertebrates, as I alluded to. The abundance, the type, the size, the color of the plastics, and the foraging strategy influence how much is ingested and the impacts thereof. And it's really important for us to consider the plastic type and the chemicals associated with these plastics in trying to understand the risks they pose. And some examples are given on the slide to the right, which is a basic typology that we use. So the potential impacts on human health, the threats of consumption of seafood with microplastics and nanoplastics, which are the worrying one, are largely unknown. The possibility of transferal of microplastics, associated chemicals, and microbes have been reported elsewhere in the world. 2 studies in South Africa show this possibility for perna and juvenile estuarine fish. However, transport to humans has not yet been investigated in the South African context. And South Africa has a number of commercially important species, and we believe that that is where the research priority should lie at the moment in terms of understanding the transfer to humans and the impacts thereof. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sershin. With that, I'm going to ask Sumaya Rabi from the CSIR to follow on from this in terms of what does this then mean in terms of impacts on ecosystem services and the South African economy. Sumaya, Sershin, if you can just end your screen share.
I'll do that.
Thank you, Linda. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see this?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Just put on full screen view.
Yeah. Sorry, just struggling with this. There we go. Okay, good morning to everyone and thank you for joining us for this session. I'm going to go through the findings of the impacts of marine plastics on ecosystem services and the economy, which I reviewed together with my colleague Anton Lehmann. So starting with the ecosystem services and looking at fisheries and aquaculture, over 12 million people engage in the fisheries sector in Africa, and the impacts of marine plastics could pose a significant problem on this industry and could impact the livelihoods of subsistence fishers. But in saying this, we could not find research that assessed the impact of marine plastics on fisheries and aquaculture in South Africa. When looking at recreation and aesthetics, so there is some research that was done on the impacts of marine litter on tourism, which did relate to recreation and aesthetics. However, these focused on looking at the economic impacts on the tourism industry or of the cost of beach cleanups in order to minimize these impacts on the tourism industry. And we therefore discussed this further in our economic impact section. When looking at the impacts on heritage, we could not find any research in that aspect. In terms of habitat provision, it's the same. There was a lack of research looking at habitat provision. When looking at biodiversity, there is a lot of research that has been done on the impacts of plastics on marine organisms, such as the impacts through ingestion or entanglement, and this was just covered in by Session in their paper. So there's no research in South Africa that could be found on the impacts on a broader level when looking at biodiversity. When looking at invasive species transport, there were some studies done, but these looked at the colonization of plastics by marine organisms, and there's no evidence of plastic serving as a substrate, particularly for alien species entering South African waters. In terms of nutrient cycles, so it's thought that plastic could affect the buoyancy of fecal matter discharged from marine outfalls, which will then affect the movement of nutrients and carbon into the deep ocean and potentially disrupting nutrient cycles. However, there's no research that is currently available to support this. Moving on to the economic costs, when looking at the tourism industry, so there have been studies done, as I previously mentioned, on the impacts of marine litter on tourism in South Africa, and studies that looked on the impacts of litter on the aesthetic value of the coast, and they showed that this results in the decreased number of visitors to polluted beaches, particularly international visitors. Then there have also been studies that looked at the costs of beach cleanups aimed at minimizing negative impacts on tourism. However, it must be noted that these studies focused mainly in the Cape region and they are outdated. And then in terms of the National Working for the Coast program, in this program, they do beach cleanups, but there were no associated costs that could be found in published sources related to this program. When looking at the impacts on transport and shipping, debris around ports can become a shipping hazard, and there's little to no assessment of the associated impacts, economic impacts around this. Then ports do incur costs in cleanup operations, and these costs of operations are also not available in published sources. However, we did manage to get some costs from the environmental manager at the Port of Durban. And in October 2017, a harbour cleanup following the storm during that time cost the port approximately 1.25 million rand, and 7 cleanup events after storms in April-May 2019 cost a further 4.35 million. So we can see from this that cleanup operation costs can increase drastically. In terms of the fishing industry, there was a lack of research regarding the impacts on this industry. Then looking at indirect and non-market economic costs in terms of human health and safety, and non-market costs such as scenic, cultural, or spiritual value, there was a lack of research. So I just want to end by summarizing using this table that we have in our paper, which highlights the gaps of knowledge in terms of the impacts of plastics on ecosystem services and the economy. And I want to say that the research that we do have currently are isolated, they're localized, or they're outdated. And we therefore need to really put in efforts to fill these gaps, through research going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Smaya. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Peter Ryan just to deal with our fifth and final paper on monitoring and methods. Peter? You're on mute, Peter.
On mute.
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. So the final paper in the series was looking at monitoring marine plastics. I put this together with Lorian Pishigru from NMU, Monica Perold, my PhD student, and Colleen Maloney, who's been with me on the plastic adventure since the 1980s. And why won't we progress? Okay. So fortunately, the timing for this paper was just after the release of the GSAMP guidelines in 2019, which was sort of a handbook on monitoring for marine plastics. So that was quite convenient. And in terms of monitoring, depending on who you read, but basically the idea is it's repeated measures over time to attain a specific goal. And it's really important that you define that goal carefully. And I think for a long time, you know, certainly those who've been in the plastics game for a long time have known that really the focus should be on assessing mitigation measures. That should be the primary goal of monitoring, going right back to the 1994 Marine Debris Conference in Miami. And obviously monitoring is a key part of the adaptive management cycle. Along the way, you can also learn other useful things. You can identify emerging problems by measuring levels of different types of pollutants in the environment. And we've certainly seen that over the years, new types of packaging coming in with specific sort of impacts on the environment. And potentially one could use monitoring to ensure compliance with standards. But at this stage, there's no real agreement internationally as to what those standards might be. So there are some regional ecological quality type guidelines, but there's nothing that's applied broadly across global scales. I think one of the interesting questions is what sizes of plastic should we monitor? This whole debate around the nomenclature for plastics, but generally we've got a gradient from nano up to megaplastics. And in terms of the abundance, there's obviously a lot more small bits of plastic out there than there are large bits, but fortunately still most of the mass of plastic is sitting in the large things. And I say fortunately because at least we can do something about the large things. So just from a pragmatic perspective, I think it's more useful to focus on the macroplastics rather than the more problematic microplastics. In terms of environmental risk, obviously microplastics tend to be more of an ingestion risk, macroplastics more of an entanglement risk. In terms of ease of sampling, it's definitely easier to work with macroplastics. In terms of understanding where things come from, it's much more informative working with large items. But most importantly, in terms of mitigation, it's definitely easier to work with macroplastics. So my perspective, which hopefully is not too biased, is we should really be focusing on the macroplastic component. And then in terms of monitoring, I think it's crucially important that we understand the dynamics of the system. A lot of studies have just tried to look at standing stocks, and I go to some length in the paper trying to explain why this can be very misleading. And this figure just summarizes that effect. So here you have potentially 3 different scenarios of growth rate where the amount of plastic entering the environment is increasing, stable, or decreasing. And depending on the turnover rate, we can see in the 3 red lines very similar trends over time. So unless you understand the turnover rate, it's really pointless trying to look at standing stocks. So it's really essential we look at the dynamics of the system rather than just the static measures. And then the paper goes through all of their options. It's in terms of the various components which can be monitored as taken from the GSAMP report. and explains why many of them are not ideal. It also summarizes the existing base data we have going back in some cases to the late 1960s, so we're quite fortunate in having a much longer history of plastics monitoring in South Africa than most parts of the world. And then comes to sort of the bottom line is what questions should we be monitoring and the monitoring approaches that are most appropriate. So I think for macroplastics, we identified 3 questions that we thought would be useful. One is the amount or composition from land-based sources changing? And here the suggestion is that we should monitor inputs in rivers and storm drains. The rationale being that the closer you are to the source, the more effective monitoring in terms of assessment. The further into the marine system you go, there's more confounding and confusing variables there are. We did consider accumulation studies as a useful tool just because we have so much comparable data from beaches. Is the amount and composition from offshore sources changing? I think here there's some scope for looking at beach litter, particularly for the long distance transport. But I think if you're interested in controlling ship-based sources, then it's best to monitor the use of port reception facilities, and that has to be done at a global level because many of the ships passing the Cape are called in South African ports. And then is the amount of macro litter on the seabed changing? And here we can make use of existing trawl surveys done for fish stock assessment. And that's already been put in place that routinely now all of the litter caught in these scientific surveys will be kept and then make it part of the standard ROV surveys as well. When it comes to microplastics, is the amount composition changing? I think there's potential to monitor ingestion by biota. Sediment cores from the seabed is probably a useful approach, but we have very little data in this country, so we're starting from scratch in terms of a baseline. And potentially one can look at beach arrival studies for sort of meso-size systems. And then are marine food webs being contaminated? I think probably the best approach is to look for plastic-specific additives in selected biota. But again, we have no baseline, so we're starting from scratch in this regard. And that's the end of the story from me.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you to all 5 of our, or 4, one went twice. Thank you to all 4 of our presenters this morning for the very succinct presentations on the full papers, which I see that our colleagues from the South African Journal of Science have been providing the links to those papers if you'd like to read more about that. So with that, I'm going to ask our presenters just to make themselves available while we deal with a few questions that have been posed in the Q&A box below. As Jane, I think it was mentioned, we will also be making a note of these, and if we don't have a chance to deal with them in the next 20 odd minutes or so, we'll make sure that the authors respond to them and we make those responses available. So the first question which I'd like to pose to Karina is, there's been a number of questions raised in the Q&A box around this issue of data. Are we sure the state of waste report, for example, notes that there are limitations in the data? Are we sure that it's a more confident estimate? We know that some comments have been raised around sort of questioning the Plastic South Africa data. Peter mentioned that we now have 3 independent lines of review, which would suggest that certainly what we're seeing in South Africa is that the numbers are less than what Jambek predicted for South Africa in terms of mismanaged plastic. So Karina, my question to you is, could you just very briefly provide an outline of how you went about calculating the numbers in terms of land-based sources of plastic and potential leakage? I know you presented that one little diagram, but if you could just give a little bit of background to that.
Okay, so in terms of the Jambek study, it's meant as an initial it's an initial baseline for us to start at, and it's based on global predictions and production statistics, which are just as available to us as to them. And it's also based on 2010 data. where the State of Waste report is published in 2018. I think it accumulated data around up till 2017, so it's a bit more recent as well. But the approach we took is going from, there was a study published in the South African Journal of Science by Rodseth and colleagues from, I think, UCT, if I have it correct, that said about 3.67 million tons of waste is mismanaged in South Africa, and that's based on certain calculations. And I think that's a bit more accurate for us at this stage. So we used that, and also from the State of Waste data, which we know has uncertainties, but so we used those two, as well as population data, where Jambek used production data and some global extrapolations, and then the population data. So Jambek stated about 4 or 5 times that they have major uncertainties, and this is a first baseline. There was a question in the Q&A, are we confident that this is more accurate than Jambek? Yes, I would say we are confident that this is more accurate than Jambek. I don't say we are confident that this is 100% the answer. I mean, one of the major things that came out in this, in our paper, is that we lack data the mass balance data that we're not able to do because we lack where exactly the waste is going, where it's coming from. Yes, so it's not 100% sure at all, but I would say we are more confident than Jambek. Linda, would you say that answers? Or
yes, thanks, Karina. I see also that Hero van Blotnitz from the University of Cape Town, who's also online, posted a response. I'm aware that they also did a material flow analysis on plastic in South Africa, and he provided the link to those results in the chat box, which I think, Karina, you've also considered as well. So I agree that I think for now we have a best estimate given the limitations, and we know that in South Africa, as in developing countries around the world, we have serious limitations in terms of accurate waste data, and it's always something we're trying to improve. But I believe that we have a nice new estimate in terms of what we're seeing that would support what Peter Ryan is suggesting in terms of what we're actually seeing in our marine environment and on our beaches. So the next question that came up, which I'd like to address to Peter, I think it was a question raised from Harrow as well, is do we have literature on the rate of plastic reducing in size through breakup in our oceans?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I've just actually typed a response and I realized I was unmuted, so sorry if you could hear me typing away there. But I don't think there's much in the way of actual empirical evidence of what goes on out at sea. I think that's quite a difficult thing to get a handle on. But I pointed him to the 2 main papers that try to address the missing plastic problem, which are Kuhlmann's paper from 2017 and the Laurent Le Breton paper from 2019. And they both include estimates of fragmentation rate as one of the parameters. So there are some numbers out there, but how empirically based they are, I'm not sure.
Thanks very much, Peter. We had another question I'm going to ask Karina as well on this one. There was a question raised that a previous publication had suggested that all pollution generated on land ends up in the sea. Is this correct?
I don't think it's correct, no. We find that we see the plastic in rivers and in this, as I said, that it gets trapped in the river sediments is something we see across the few papers that have looked at freshwater plastic pollution. We see it gets stuck in the sediments and in the it can get resuspended, but what we are also seeing, and I know Peter Ryan, you've also done some work on that, is on the movement of plastic in the rivers and how far they can travel. They don't seem to, especially the larger pieces of plastic, they don't seem to travel very far from their sources. So no, I would not say that all the plastic that we, or the waste that we generate eventually ends up in the sea. I think it gets buried on land and also in the rivers and so on.
I think you mentioned when you spoke about the evidence gaps that we know that our freshwater environment is a potential long-term sink and source of future marine plastic And I suppose one of the uncertainties is perhaps the rate at which that mobilizes back into the environment and ends up back in the marine environment. Is that correct?
It is, and also what portion of it gets into the sediments and how far they are traveling. We are looking at that at this stage, some preliminary studies, but we're not sure about all those exactly.
Thank you.
Can I chip in?
Yeah, sure, Peter.
Thanks. Yeah, I see the answers that we type into the Q&A don't seem to appear. I see Harrow's complaining that he can't see the responses. And I was trying to send.
Sorry, I think they move over to another tab, which is indicated as answered. So they move from the open into the answered tab.
Okay, because I also typed a response to that question as well. And there's some really interesting papers that are coming out of France now where they track a particular product, and they've been showing by sort of monitoring various places along the Seine that they've got bits of these, I'm not entirely sure they are bottles or something, that go back 50 years are popping up. So rivers can certainly be long-term sinks, but you know, are we talking long-term human lifespan or long-term geological cycles? I think in the very long geological sort of time frames, then the ocean is the long-term repository for most pollution.
Thanks, Peter. There's a question, an interesting question that's been raised by Christina Troy, who asks, with respect to mapping entries of marine litter in rivers, what remote sensing methods can we recommend to do waste stream analysis and waste characterization? Do we have any experience on different remote sensing methods that may be applicable to determine what is in our environment, in our freshwater environment on land and at sea? I'm opening this to all the presenters who may have experience on this topic.
My suggestion is get down and go and measure it on the ground.
Can I come in there, Prof?
Yes, it's a search, yes.
So we've been doing some work with Amgeni water, and we've been looking at remote sensing methods. At present, they're semi-quantitative at best. It can show you presence, absence, and this is largely surface-based, but you know, nothing of real value in terms of quantitative data. And also the resolution of the images that are available for this sort of research are quite expensive, as you need very high resolution imagery to visualize or assess plastic pollution within aquatic bodies using remote sensing methods. There is some work that has recently come out of China, which looks at rivers, but at present, streams and rivers in South Africa, it is not financially viable yet to use remote sensing methods for picking up plastic pollution. At best, we can do presence absence, but in terms of a heat map, in terms of quantitative data that is reliable enough to draw correlations and make conclusions, I don't think that we are there yet. But I must confirm that Amgeni Water and the Institute of Natural Resources is presently looking at using remote sensing methods as an early warning system in catchments to try to identify plastic hotspots.
Great. Thank you, Serjan. And Christina, I'd also recommend that you chat to the folks at Sustainable Seas Trust managing the Africa Marine Waste Network. I think they've also been doing some work on remote sensing and use of drone technology, etc. there as well. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that group in terms of being able to pick up through alternative methods. Thank you. The next question that was raised, and I'm going to pose to Peter as well, was a question around presentation of abundance results. Which unit is acceptable? Is it number of items per distance or number of items per area?
I think it depends where you're measuring. I think where you're dealing something like along a coastline where you've got essentially a linear front, I think it's much more sensible to report per linear length of coastline. but when you're measuring the amount of litter floating at sea, obviously it has to be per unit area, or if it's in mid-water, then per unit volume. So there's no single answer to that.
Thanks, Peter. There was a question posed by Tony, which I think I'll answer if I may, which said that Minister Creasy has scrapped the initial Section 28 Industry Waste Management Plan in favour of a Section 18 voluntary industry-led plan. How effective can this be? Well, firstly, I think just a correction is that Section 18 would not be a voluntary industry plan. Section 18 is extended producer responsibility, and it would be mandatory extended producer responsibility. So it means that all producers, as identified by the department, would then be under legislation enforced to implement their producer responsibility, whether that be financial, operational, or both. So I think personally, I was pleased to see the move from Section 18, from Section 28, the Industry Waste Management Plans, specifically to Section 18, which is EPR, which I think is the correct policy instrument to use in this case. I'm confident that it will provide a policy instrument that will increase our diversion of waste from landfill rates in South Africa, and also address the mismanaged paper and packaging and electronic waste, lighting and tires as well, because it applies to all of those. So I look forward to the implementation of Section 18. It's, I suppose, somewhat unfortunate we've lost so many years in this process of moving us to this point. So that is my response on that question. So we just have a few more minutes before we end the webinar this morning. I'm going to continue just to scan through to see if there are any questions we haven't addressed. But what I'd like to do is just to ask each of our 4 presenters if they could focus on just one key research need, one evidence gap, one research need that we need to fill in South Africa. What would that be? So I'm just going to go through the order: Karina, and then Peter, Sershin, Sumaya, and then back to Peter again. If you can just give feedback in terms of your top research need in your specific thematic area. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I would say the top need that we have, and most of the questions are arising of that, and I think it's, as you also mentioned, it's a constant work towards it, but is more accurate waste and waste management data. That would be my, well, it's a data need, and in terms of research need is how much is entering our environment and where is it going.
Thank you, Corinne. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I still go back to the point that we know enough to know that we need to act, and research is not the priority, acting is the priority. But if I was pushed to say on research, then I would echo what Corinne's just said, that really we need to understand the fluxes better, certainly from a FATES perspective.
Thank you, Peter. I think it's a very powerful statement, that one, is that, you know, we do know enough about the plastic issue in our environment, and it's time for action, and not necessarily just to continue with research. Obviously, there is a priority to close the evidence gaps that we do have. I think especially from what I see around understanding the impacts, and particularly the economic impacts of plastic in our freshwater, marine environments and on land. Sershin, to you, in terms of ecological impacts, what would you say would be the priority?
Yeah, I think I will have to concur with the previous 2 speakers in that I think we know now that there are ecological impacts. Certainly there's a deficit of data in terms of population level. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
In terms of population level effects, but I think where we are lacking from a South African perspective is understanding the ability of systems to retain plastics and how those plastics are moving through trophic levels. I think we need to get a better handle on that in order to start to understand what are the ecological effects. Right at the moment, we are describing them, and we need to move towards interpreting them in terms of effects.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Sumaya?
Sure. I think in our review just highlighted the significant gaps in terms of the economics and ecosystem services. So to pick one would be a challenge. I think we need to really focus our efforts in looking at, quantifying ecological, social, economic impacts of marine plastics and compare this with the cost of policy responses. So how do we respond in terms of policy to manage these? There's no point, we want to have appropriate policy response and implement that where the overall cost of that policy exceed the overall benefits. And, we don't want to just go out and ban plastics, a total ban of it, and then bring in an alternative. We need to think of what will that alternative also have. It will have impacts, and we need to consider it from that aspect. I think looking at, the cost of beach cleanups and taking that cost into consideration and looking at how we could rather invest that in a policy initiative that will make some changes where we need to put in some focus. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sumaya. And Peter, back to you for the last comments.
Yeah, I think the monitoring needs are really around, I see it as a service to the broader question of how do we actually tackle the problem. And the pressing research need is, what are the sort of social tools that we can use to change people's behavior effectively, whether it's incentives or threat of fines or whatever. So that the research questions are more in the social sciences than in the understanding the actual problem. So we again probably have sufficient baselines and potential to provide feedback on whether mitigation measures are working or not. It's up to society to come up with the appropriate policies that might actually make a difference.
Thanks, Peter. I will say on that one, our SAJS chair in Waste and Society at the University of the Western Cape, Professor Rini Schenk, is doing some really, really nice work and interesting work in communities, looking at why people do litter, and as you've just mentioned now, the behavioral responses that we need to put in place to stop that, and some very, very interesting findings that they're coming up with through their research. So also just keep an eye on the research that's coming out of the University of the Western Cape, out of the SAJS chair on waste and behavior. So with that, I'd like to thank the presenters of each of our papers, and please also pass the message back to your co-authors on those papers where they're worth for the contributions that they've made. I think these are 5 great papers that provide now for us a status quo in terms of marine plastic debris in South Africa, and I look forward how we move this topic forward in the future. With that, I'd like to pass back to our colleagues at the South African Journal of Science to wrap up the webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Linda. Thank you to the presenters, of course, who've done such a fantastic job in alerting us to the sort of key areas for the further thought, further research, and also I thought a very important point about how we can feed into policy and social behaviour, because that is just as important, I think, to the country as it is to understand where these plastics go to and where they come from. So thank you to all of you, and a special thank you to Linda, but also thank you to the 55 participants who have been listening to this, and I hope have gone away with information and will have a look at these papers more carefully. And just to thank you finally, Linda, for putting this together, for bringing such interesting material the way of the journal. And we look forward to perhaps continuing the conversation by publishing more material from the group, from the SAJS chair you mentioned, and just keeping this matter alive for the benefit of our oceans, but also ultimately for our country. So thank you, everybody. It really has been a pleasure to host this, and we look forward to more research and more communications. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Jay.